Spring is coming soon, and what better way to enjoy it than planning a camping trip? Now let's see here. Tent? Check. Flashlights? Check. PTSD from experiencing something nightmarish while camping? We'll have to wait and see. Today, I've got more new camping scary stories to set your fears ablaze. Enjoy, and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. I'm looking for scary cabin stories. Also, check out eeriecast.com for more terrifying shows. Now, let's begin. My Untold Camping Trip. From Amelia Y. I've never told anyone this story before, since I was scared they'd think I'm insane. I was a 13-year-old girl with rather bad eyesight. I was never an outdoor person. I liked staying inside my room, and I hated leaving it, since I always felt unsafe and anxious around everyone, family and strangers alike. So my parents decided to send me and my younger sister, who was 2 years behind me, on a 1-week camping trip during the wonderful month of August. Saying that I wasn't very happy about it would be an understatement. We arrived on the campground where I met my camp leaders. There were 3 in total, ages ranging from 19 to 22. I was put into a tent with a few other girls. We set up our sleeping bags for the night, yet none of us slept. The others were just chatting the entire night while I listened. When morning came, we were all very tired. I could tell they weren't used to staying up all night. Personally, I had a very broken sleep schedule. I would sleep for about 4 hours a week, so I was fine. Or rather, I was used to it. That day we did some camp activities, like learning how to start a fire and how to identify plants. I even saw a couple of deer. I'll skip ahead a few days since nothing happened for the next 3 days. On the second to last night to spend at the camp, I really wanted to go back home. Again, I couldn't sleep, so I was just using a very subtle nightlight to read. It barely illuminated the pages, since I was careful not to wake up the leaders and the girls in my tent. It was then I noticed how eerily quiet it was, other than my slow breathing and the pages I was turning. I brushed off this unease, this silence, and decided to enjoy it. After all, I think silence is underrated. Suddenly, the girl next to me woke up, and groggily told me she wanted to use the bathroom, but she was too scared to go alone. I mean, who wouldn't be? The nearest bathroom was at least 2 miles away, and walking those 2 miles in the woods and then back uphill would be tiring to say the least. I gave her a comforting smile, telling her I'd go with her, even though I wanted to stay in the tent in the warmth of my sleeping bag and the peacefulness of my light yellow glow of my nightlight. I twisted my ankle a day prior, and it hurt, but I didn't bring it up, and I endured it. I got out of the tent with the slightly taller girl, and I turned on my flashlight. We walked slowly about 100 feet into the woods, so we wouldn't disturb anyone. She quickly went behind a tree then and did her business, while I used my flashlight to observe the darkness of the woods. An immense amount of dread hit me like a buzz, and I thought I was having another panic attack. My anxiety became worse when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. On reflex, I pointed my flashlight in that direction. "Amelia," a familiar voice called out. My sister's voice. Wait, my sister's voice. She was 8 miles away on the other side of the campground in a cabin. I was confused. My sister could never walk that far, in the dark no less. She was scared of the dark, and her stamina was low. I turned to where the voice came from, and I pointed my flashlight in that direction. Just out of the light's glow stood a girl, just an inch shorter than me, with short brown hair and a naturally skinny figure. The more I inspected her, the more I noticed. She was skinnier than usual, actually. My sister is already very petite. You can see her bones through her skin. But that girl I saw in the forest, who resembled my sister, I could see each and every bone in her body exactly where it was, and her joints appeared broken. That was when my campmate finished her business. She came back and reached for my arm. When she made contact with me, I flinched. "It's just me," she said. Her voice held concern and emotion, but it was just her. "Amelia," my sister called out again. It seemed as if her voice was a recording getting played repeatedly. I kept looking at the figure until the girl behind me asked barely above a whisper, "Who is that?" in a questioning tone. I answered, "It looks like my sister, but it can't be her." I spoke in a quiet whisper. The girl barely heard me. "We should go," I said sternly this time, but I tried to keep my voice barely above a whisper. So the two of us did what any logical people would do. We ran. My ankle hurt so much, but I never stopped, and I could hear that thing that looked like my sister trying to catch up to us. It was fast, but we were faster. We got to the campgrounds, and we immediately got inside the tent. Only then did I realize how bad my ankle actually hurt. "Ew, what's that smell?" The girl to my left said. It smelled of rot and iron, a smell I was familiar with due to living on a farm for 8 years of my life. I quickly replied with, "Somebody probably took a dump near the campsite." I lied, knowing they'd believe me. "Probably just one of the boys." The girl replied with a tired eye roll. I smiled at her and told her she should get some rest. Everyone who had awakened went back to sleep. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring out the small opening of the window of our tent. It was still there, yet it no longer looked like my sister. Instead, it looked like my mother. A creepy smile stretched across its face. I made eye contact with it. My mother's green eyes had been replaced with a milky white. I looked away after noticing that. I kept thinking, I need to make it through this night. Just tonight and tomorrow night, and I can go back home. I was doing my best not to have a panic attack. Finally, morning came, and we went through our usual day. But, of course, night returned. That night, I tried my best to fall asleep, which I actually did. The following morning, we packed our things and said our goodbyes. I got in my parents' car with my sister when they showed up. My mother and father greeted us with smiles, asking about our trip. "It was decent," I replied in my usual quiet, monotone voice. "I thought it was fun." My little sister smiled with joy lacing her tone. It was her. It wasn't that creature, that mimic. I was relieved to know this was my real sister. We got home, and I immediately took a shower, and after unpacking, I went skateboarding, which I do to get my mind off of things. That day, I made a conclusion that I would never go camping again. My experience in the rural Oregon mountains, from Wicked Wendigo. When I would hear the old adage, "right place at the right time," I'd think to myself, yeah, okay, it's all just coincidence. But after what I've been through these past 6 weeks, my mind is changing. Maybe you're put in a specific place at a specific time for a reason. As most of you know, the PNW, Pacific Northwest for those unfamiliar, was recently ravaged by an ungodly amount of wildfires. At the time of writing this, I mean. Seeing the little fire emojis dotted all over maps of California, Oregon, and Washington made my heart ache. My home was burning. Fortunately, for myself and my family, our area hadn't been hit as hard as many others. I'd planned a camping trip a few weeks prior to this pandemic of wildfires, so I was happy to see that my usual spot wasn't near any major fires, and subsequently had been deemed safe to travel and camp in. I'm a camping enthusiast, and I enjoy deep wilderness camping. My usual spot is fairly remote. It requires a 2-hour drive up a 2-lane road into the middle of nowhere, followed by a 30-minute drive up an old logging road that ultimately crests a small mountain, The mountain's slope leads into a beautiful valley, with much larger mountains encircling the valley from the north and east. In the center was a decently sized clearing. The clearing was littered with fallen logs, beautiful pink and yellow yarrow flowers, and the occasional family of white-tailed deer. This was my true happy place. This valley has a name, but I'll keep it hidden for anonymity purposes. I left on a Tuesday morning in early September. The drive to the mountain was relatively uneventful, besides almost hitting a large buck who decided to cross the road right in front of my truck. I arrived on the mountain crest on schedule and began unpacking the bed of my truck. I had just recently bought a new 2020 Toyota Tacoma. I parked my truck facing the clearing, roughly 5 feet from the edge of a small drop-off. The slope down to the valley wasn't steep, and it's fairly easy to hike down. I'd say it's about 400 to 450 feet from where I parked down to the start of the valley floor. I had my camp set up just as dusk was setting. I'd usually have a large fire going, but with the previously mentioned wildfires, that wasn't possible. I brought a small propane stove and space heater to prevent any accidents. As I finished gulping down my last bite of dinner, I noticed it was quickly growing dark. I hopped off my tailgate and made my way to my driver's side door. As I was digging in my pockets for my keys, I looked down into the valley, and I noticed something strange. I could make out 2 small circular lights in the far distance. They flickered as they quickly moved closer to the clearing. It looked as if they were hovering and navigating through the trees at a steady pace. I crouched in front of my truck, and I looked on in curiosity. I watched for a few minutes until the lights eventually arrived at the tree line of the clearing. I could hear the humming of motorcycle engines echoing from the valley. That's when I realized what I was staring at. What on earth were these 2 people doing, riding dirt bikes out here? This was the first time I'd ever seen another person out here. The lights were stationary at this point. I assumed the 2 riders were off their bikes and walking around the clearing. Although this is only speculation, as I couldn't see anything aside from the 2 bike headlights. I knew they couldn't see me as I had no visible lights on or a campfire. Instantly, I thought to grab my phone out of my glove box. Local news stations warned the public of suspicious people intentionally starting fires in the woods. They encouraged citizens to be vigilant and gather any evidence they could. In an absolute lapse in judgment, I pressed the unlock button on my keys. My truck lights flashed, and a loud beeping sound rang out. I had just given a beacon to my location to these midnight riders. In a rush of adrenaline, I threw myself on the ground stomach first. My mind was screaming, "Good going, Einstein." I could barely think as my heart was pounding in my ears. I watched as the bike lights began to turn back into the direction they came from, and eventually, they disappeared into the dark. I could hear the engines revving harder than they had before. That unsettled me a bit. As I stood up and brushed myself off, I began thinking about how odd it was. Usually people with good intentions do not run off like that when they notice other campers. These people were obviously up to no good down there. Maybe they were drug traffickers, meth cookers, arsonists. My mind was filled with all the potential threats I might have alerted to my location. I sat in my truck, mulling over my options. Should I drive home? What if they're waiting for me at the end of the logging road? Or was I just overreacting? I decided to pack up camp and spend the night in my truck and drive home first thing in the morning. After packing everything up, I drove down the logging road a little ways and backed into a small gap in the mountain face. That way, if the midnight riders decided to pay me a visit, they might just miss me. I was in full paranoia mode. I lowered my seat back, racked around into my handgun, and eventually dozed off as the adrenaline turned into exhaustion. I awoke to my alarm, with My Life for Hire by ADTR blaring from my phone. In a groggy daze, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. My phone said 6:32 a.m. Looking out my windshield, I could see thick brown smoke swirling in the wind. As I stepped out of my truck, I was hit with the intense smell of burning wood. As you've probably guessed now, there was a fire very close by. I jumped back into my truck and raced back up the mountain. From my camping spot, I'd be able to get a better understanding of the situation. As I drove way too fast up this narrow logging road, I noticed the smoke was thinning out as my elevation grew. My heart sank at the realization. When I reached the crest, I jumped into the truck bed and looked out over the valley. I could see blue skies above the mountains across from me to the north and east. My heart sank at this, as it confirmed my suspicion. I turned towards the logging road to my right. I could see the smoke thicken from that direction. I was trapped. My mind instantly went to the two riders from the previous night. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. Of course, no such luck. I jumped off my truck bed and threw my passenger door open. I frantically searched for my backpack. Once I found it, I ripped it apart, looking for my GPS satellite phone. I kissed it with joy when I grabbed it from the bottom of the bag. I flipped it open and thanked the Lord I had a signal. I called 911 to report the fire and request help. I chatted with the operator for about 15 minutes. The operator said she'd contact local wildland firefighting companies and attempt to get a helicopter to evacuate me. After being on hold for a few minutes, I was transferred to a helicopter pilot who worked for a wildland firefighting company that was nearby. I mentioned the valley by name, and the man said he knew where it was. He claimed they were sending a helicopter to pick me up, and that I needed to be there and ready to leave as soon as they landed. After we disconnected, I rushed to clear out my truck of any valuables. I sadly rubbed the dashboard and said, "Sorry," to my new truck, as it was evident the fire would eventually consume her. I then gradually started making my way down the slope and into the valley. After only falling a few times, I reached the valley floor. I then bolted through the trees and towards the clearing. My lungs were on fire as I neared the clearing. As I broke through the tree line, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. After a few minutes of lying there, catching my breath, I got back onto my feet. I started walking towards the center of the clearing. When I made it to what I assumed was the center, I glanced up at the peak of the small mountain. I could see my bright red truck sitting where I left it. Roughly 200 feet to the left of it was a wall of fire. Black smoke rose from the wall as it raced up the mountain. I turned away, not wanting to watch $39,000 literally going up in flames. I began scanning the skies, searching for my rescue. I concentrated on listening for the chopping sound of a helicopter's rotors. As I stood there listening, I heard something else that made me question my sanity. Just to my left, I could hear someone crying out. A shockwave ran through me. I stood there, unable to believe my ears. I unholstered my handgun and called back. "Hello? Is someone there?" I then began to hear muffled screaming. I ran toward the screaming, trying to hold back tears. I noticed a piece of plywood, roughly 4 by 8 feet, covered in branches and dirt. It lay on the ground with a large boulder set on top of it. I called again. "Hello?" I heard the muffled scream again. This time, it was much louder and unmistakable. Is there really someone under that plywood? I thought to myself. I rushed over to attempt to move the boulder. After struggling a few times, I managed to push the boulder off the plywood. Slowly, I lifted up the plywood and threw it to the side. What I saw is something I'll never forget. Sitting inside the small hole, which was no bigger than 4 by 4 feet, was a woman. Her wrists were zip-tied, and her mouth was gagged with a piece of cloth. I gasped and took a step back. I couldn't believe it. What in the world was going on? The woman was frantically looking around. I snapped out of my shock and rushed to help her. She flinched as I reached out to grab her. I lifted her out of the hole and I removed the cloth from her mouth. She began to yell in Spanish and she raised her arms. I told her, "Calm down, you're safe now." I cut the zip ties that were binding her wrists. She instantly started pointing behind me and repeating, "Mi hija." I didn't understand her, as unfortunately I didn't know Spanish. I turned around quickly. Where she was pointing, I noticed 4 more pieces of plywood scattered across the clearing. I was horrified. I rushed over and began to flip them over one by one, but one by one they were empty. The woman, following me as I did this, let out a pained cry as I flipped the last piece of plywood, exposing a fourth and final empty hole. She collapsed on the ground and began to sob. I tried to ask what was wrong, but I couldn't understand her. As I tried to console her, I heard the distinct sound of helicopter rotors. I looked up to see the chopper descending into the valley. I helped the woman up and I put her arm over my shoulder as we rushed to the awaiting chopper. A man jumped out from the side doors. When we made it to him, he helped the woman in, then stopped and yelled, "You didn't tell us there'd be two of you." I yelled back, trying to be heard over the loud rotors. "I just found her. I have no idea what's happening." He then replied, "You found her? What are you? Never mind. We don't have time. Get in." He helped me into the helicopter and shut the doors. Soon after, we started to ascend. I looked down over the valley to see the fire had engulfed the peak and was halfway down the slope towards the valley. I sat back in relief. I was finally safe, but I had so many questions. The state police and EMTs met us when we landed back at base camp. I explained the entire situation, and they took the woman and I back to the station. Eventually, I was released after telling my story to 6 different officers. My wife picked me up and I was able to return home. That wasn't the end, unfortunately. Over these last 6 weeks, I was interviewed by local authorities, state authorities, US Marshals, ICE, even a pair of FBI agents. My final interview was with the 2 FBI agents. They were the only ones who gave me any real information on the situation. After retelling my story, just as I did here, they filled in some holes for me. They explained that I likely stumbled upon a human trafficking operation. When I unlocked my truck, it spooked the traffickers. He said I was lucky I hid in that gap when I did, as they more than likely went up the logging road to handle me. When they couldn't locate me, they probably assumed I'd left to get the police, so they packed up any valuable assets, including the woman's younger daughter, and started the fire to destroy any evidence before I could alert the authorities. I asked about the girl I found. The older agent informed me that she and her daughter had been kidnapped from Nicaragua. The woman claimed they were set to be sold to someone in Russia, but now she was being held in government custody until she could be returned home. He then said, "She's lucky you came along when you did. You were at the right place at the right time." I've always called it a Dryad. From ShadeCollins. It may not be a long story or a great story, but it happened. I've worked in construction most of my life, so I'm not much of a storyteller type, so bear with me. It was around 26 years ago. My parents had just bought me a pup tent for my monthly Boy Scout campouts because I was 14 and several of the high school kids had left me covered in bruises during the previous campouts over the last year. This pup tent was about 6 feet long and 3-ish feet high. It was a dark green A-frame style tent, with an entrance at one side with a zippered mosquito net cover, one down the middle and one from each side. There was also a rain cover outside of the tent that could be tied with 2 binding sets of straps. Whenever we'd go camping, the first thing we would do was clear the area of debris. In this case, it was sticks and long grass. We had to use lawnmowers from the Scoutmaster's trailer to cut it down. So after my first day out, I set up my little tent outside and away, maybe 15 to 20 feet from the big 8-person tents that all the other kids were sleeping in. I crawled in as there was barely room to sit upright inside of it, and just enough room to turn around in the tent without hitting the sides. I got into my blue summer sleeping bag, zipped it up, made sure my camping pack was by my feet, and I went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. Someone was messing with the zipper. I was basically alone, so hearing the brand new zipper come up was enough to wake me. I grabbed my flashlight, a mini mag light, with my right hand, and I sat up and flashed it at my feet, which were by the entrance. And what I saw made no sense at the time. There was a girl with her head in my tent up to her shoulders, with her hands in my backpack. She didn't seem to be wearing a top of any kind. The only reason I call this a girl is because it had cleavage, but my size 12 feet were in the way, so I didn't see her chest. Its skin was a pale green, and its hair was a deeper forest green, tied back into what I could best describe as dreadlocks. It took me a minute to notice, but there seemed to be leaves in the thing's hair. They seemed to be ivy leaves. Her face could be traditionally described as beautiful. Gaunt features, high cheekbones. Her eyes were like a cat's pupils, but the eye color was brown. She had dark-colored lips, not quite black, but really close. The moment I popped up with my light, she, or it, bared its teeth and hissed, quickly pulling itself out of the tiny tent. I'll never forget those teeth. They weren't humanoid teeth. Instead, they were long and sharp like a dog's. I did try to go after it, but by the time I shifted around and got out of my bag and exited the tent, she was gone, as were the contents of the snacks I had hidden in my bag. From that point on, I slept with the rest of the kids in the big tents, and we used my pup tent to hold extra gear, like people's backpacks. I know it's not a very exciting story. The whole experience lasted less than 2 minutes. Since then, I've always been wary of nature. I don't really talk about it because who'd believe a story like this, even though it does sort of haunt me to this day. Paranormal Camping from Misery 941. My step-grandparents owned a lot of property in the mountains of Morgan County, Utah. My siblings and I spent a lot of time exploring the woods there, which were right behind my grandparents' house. Skip forward 20 years. My grandparents have long since passed away, but I still spend a lot of time in these mountains camping. Since it's private property, we don't see many people while camping there. I've experienced many strange things while out there, but this is one of the strangest. 2 of my friends and I were staying overnight in a trailer we had on the property. We were just talking and hanging out. All of a sudden, we heard a very loud vibrating wind sound, and the trailer began to shake and sort of vibrate. It lasted about 30 to 45 seconds, then abruptly stopped. We all looked at each other, and I could tell they were just as confused as I was. We opened the door, and it was as calm as it had been right before it happened. There was no storm, no wind, no rain, nothing. I have no idea what it could have been. On another occasion, 2 different friends and I were hiking up to a cabin that I had found in the woods on an earlier trip. You have to climb over a gate to get to the cabin, which was still about 300 feet through thick trees. I climbed over the gate first and started walking through the tall grass that was just before the trees. Then, on the path about 20 feet in front of me, I saw a very, very large dog. The dog was all white, with long hair and very dark eyes. He was just sitting there staring at me. He didn't move or make a sound. I slowly started backing up, and I told my friend to back up also. My other friend was just getting over the fence and asked what we were doing. I told her we were trying to get away from the big dog without upsetting it. Both my friends looked confused, but backed up anyway, and we all went back over the fence. After that, they told me that they didn't see any dog anywhere. I thought that was impossible, because that dog I saw was huge and sitting right in the middle of the path. Another time, the same friends and I were gathering wood for a fire. We were on a hillside on the opposite side of the road from camp. When we looked in the direction of camp, we could see a door, a perfect door with a window and doorknob, just kind of floating at the base of some trees. All 3 of us saw this, but we didn't have cell phones, so we couldn't get a picture. These are just a few of the weird things that happened on this mountain. It's a very strange place. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.